A 78-year-old retired Army aviator walked slowly through the static display area of the Mid-Valley Regional Air Show on a warm Saturday afternoon in late September, leaning on his cane, nodding politely at the families crowded around the restored aircraft. He stopped in front of a single Bell UH-1 Huey gunship parked on the grass, faded olive drab, fresh clear coat over the original markings, a velvet rope strung across the open cargo door. He stared at the tail boom for a long moment. Then he stepped over the rope and slowly, painfully began to pull himself up onto the cargo deck. The crew chief on duty was on him in 3 seconds. So was the airshow volunteer. So was a young security guard in a polo shirt. 3 voices at once. "Sir, you can't climb in there. Sir, that's a display aircraft. Sir, please step back behind the rope." A small crowd gathered to watch the disturbance. Phones came out, a few people chuckled. One woman muttered something about old men trying to act young. The old veteran did not argue. He did not even look angry. He just let go of the door frame, stepped carefully back down to the grass, and quietly asked the crew chief if he could please show him something. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn field jacket and pulled out a folded yellow document, something the crew chief had clearly never expected to see at an airshow. It was a 1968 flight log, 43 pages, cover stamped by the 1st Cavalry Division, signed in faded blue ink by a young warrant officer who, on February 9th, 1968, flew this exact tail number into a hot landing zone 3 times in a row to extract 10 wounded soldiers under heavy fire, and then flew it home to base on 1 engine and a transmission that was bleeding fluid the entire way. If you believe the men who flew these birds home deserve to climb back into them whenever they want, type respect in the comments before this story goes any further. His name was Thomas Brennan, CW4, United States Army, retired. He had spent 2 tours in Vietnam, a 3rd on the DMZ in Korea, and the last 14 years of his service flying medevac and training pilots at Fort Rucker before the Army finally cut him loose in 1989. Most of the men he had served with were dead now, some of them in the war, some of them in the long quiet years after, the way the war kept killing people decades later. He lived alone in a small white house in a town not far from the airfield, with a vegetable garden and a Labrador named Cobra, and a wall in the spare bedroom covered in photographs nobody ever asked to see. He did not talk much about Vietnam. He had never been to a reunion. He had never marched in a parade. The flight log in his pocket was the only thing he had ever brought with him out of that war that he still carried around. Folded, refolded, taped on the spine where the cardboard had given up, the blue ink gone grey on the pages he looked at the most. He had driven out to the airshow that morning because his neighbour had mentioned, in passing, that the static display would include a Huey gunship with an unusual tail number. Tom had asked the neighbour to repeat the number twice. Then he had gone inside, sat down on the edge of his bed, and stared at the wall for almost 20 minutes before he finally got up, put on his field jacket and gone out to the truck. The crew chief, a man named Garcia in his early 30s wearing a clean tan flight suit and a name tape that said Restoration Team, took the flight log carefully in both hands. He read the first page slowly. The blood drained out of his face the way blood drains out of a man's face when he realizes he has just made a mistake that cannot be unmade. He turned to the 2nd page. He turned to the 3rd. He looked up at the tail boom of the Huey behind him, then back at the document, then at the old man standing quietly on the grass with his cane and his cracked leather work boots. Garcia handed the log to the airshow volunteer, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Petrie, who had been the loudest of the 3 when she had told the old man to step back. Mrs. Petrie read 1 page and her hand started shaking. She handed the log to the security guard, a kid no older than 22, whose polo shirt had a yellow plastic name tag clipped to the collar. The kid read 3 sentences and then very quietly took his hand off the velvet rope and stepped 1 full pace backward, the way a man steps back from something he has just realized is sacred. Garcia keyed the radio on his shoulder. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "I need the chief pilot at Static Display 3. Right now. I need him here right now." Then he turned back to Tom Brennan and said, Sir, I am so sorry. Would you please wait here just 1 minute?" Tom nodded. He did not say anything. He looked at the tail boom of the Huey, the way a man looks at a face he has not seen in 58 years. The chief pilot of the Mid-Valley Air Show was a man named Robert Calloway. He was 77 years old, a retired Major General, 2 combat tours in Iraq earlier in his career, 3 distinguished flying crosses on his record, the kind of man who walked into a hangar and made every conversation in it stop on its own. He came across the field in a golf cart that he abandoned 20 yards out, walking the rest of the way on foot because he had heard the tail number Garcia said over the radio, and his legs had stopped wanting to drive. The crowd around the Huey had grown to perhaps 40 people now, and they parted for him the way crowds always parted for him. He stopped 6 feet from Tom Brennan. He looked at the old man's face. He looked at the field jacket. He looked at the cane. And then Major General Robert Calloway, retired, 2 stars, 3 DFCs, 77 years old, dropped slowly to one knee on the grass in front of the Huey and began, very quietly, to weep. "Mr. Brennan," he said. His voice was not steady. "Mr. Brennan, sir, you probably don't remember me. I was 19 years old. I was the 3rd one on the 2nd lift. I had a round through my hip and another through my left forearm, and I was bleeding out under a banana tree about 40 meters from where you put this bird down the 2nd time. My platoon sergeant threw me onto your deck and you took off through tracer fire I can still see when I close my eyes. You came back twice more, sir. Twice more, after we all told you on the radio not to. The Army made me a general, Mr. Brennan. The Army made me a general because of what you did on the 9th of February 1968. I have been looking for you a long time, sir. A very long time." Tom Brennan's mouth moved, but no sound came out of it for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You were the kid in the green undershirt." Calloway nodded. He could not speak. Tom said, I remember your sergeant. Big man, Polish name. He was screaming at me through the door because we were taking rounds through the floor and he wanted me to lift before he was all the way on. I told him I was not lifting until he was on the deck." Calloway nodded again. He still could not speak. Tom said, "Did your sergeant make it home, son?" Calloway shook his head. Tom closed his eyes for a long moment. Then he opened them and said, "I'm sorry to hear that. He was a good man." The crowd around the Huey had gone completely silent. Mrs. Petrie was crying openly. The young security guard had taken off his hat and was holding it against his chest. Garcia was standing at parade rest without seeming to know that he was doing it. Calloway stood up. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He turned to the crowd and he said, in the clear command voice of a man who had spent 40 years giving orders to soldiers, "This is Chief Warrant Officer 4 Thomas Brennan, United States Army, retired. On the 9th of February 1968, this man flew this aircraft, this exact aircraft, this tail number, the one you have all been taking pictures of for the last 6 hours, into a hot LZ in the Ayadrang Valley 3 times under heavy fire. He extracted 10 wounded soldiers from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, including me. He brought this aircraft home on one engine and a leaking transmission. He was 25 years old. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor for what he did that afternoon. He never came to the ceremony. He told the awards officer to mail it to him. He has not, to my knowledge, ever spoken about that day in public, and 10 minutes ago, 3 of my staff stopped him from climbing back into the aircraft he saved my life in." Calloway turned to Garcia and Mrs. Petrie and the security guard. "You did not know. I'm not angry with you, but you will help me make this right." He turned back to Tom. "Sir, Mr. Brennan, with your permission, I would like to take down this rope. I would like you to climb up into the cargo deck of this aircraft and sit in any seat you want for as long as you want. I would like the crowd here to give you the time and the silence you have earned. I would like to do this right now." Tom Brennan looked at the Huey. He looked at the rope. He looked at the man kneeling, standing now, in front of him with 2 stars on his retired uniform and tears still wet on his face. And he nodded, just once, the way old pilots nod when they're about to do something they have done 1,000 times before. Garcia was already taking down the velvet rope. Mrs. Petrie was already moving the crowd back. The young security guard was already holding out his arm to help the old man up onto the deck the way a son helps a father. Tom did not need the arm. He took it anyway. He climbed up onto the cargo deck of UH-1H, tail number 68, 15527, and he walked forward through the cabin and he sat down in the right seat, the pilot's seat, the one he had sat in for 473 combat hours, and he put his hands on the cyclic and the collective, the way a man puts his hands on the face of a wife he has not seen in 58 years. He did not say anything. He did not cry. He simply sat there with his hands on the controls and his eyes closed and his lips moving very slightly the way the lips of old men move when they are speaking to the dead. Behind him on the grass, Major General Robert Calloway had come to attention. He was holding a salute. His arm was perfectly still. After a moment, the security guard came to attention and held a salute too, even though he had never served. After another moment, Garcia did the same. Then Mrs. Petrie. Then a man in the crowd who turned out to be a Marine Corps gunnery sergeant retired. Then his wife. Then a teenage boy in a Boy Scout uniform. Then a woman holding a toddler. Within 30 seconds, every person within 100 feet of that Huey was standing at attention, hand to brow or hand to heart, in complete silence. While inside the cargo bay, an old warrant officer sat in the seat he had earned and said goodbye, very quietly, to the men he had not been able to bring home. He sat in that seat for almost 20 minutes. Nobody hurried him. Nobody spoke. The air show went on at the other end of the field. The announcer kept announcing, the warbirds kept flying, but the small patch of grass around Static Display 3 remained perfectly still, like a chapel that nobody had built but that everyone present recognized as a chapel anyway. When he finally climbed down, Calloway was waiting for him with a folded piece of paper in his hand. It was a printed copy of the Distinguished Flying Cross citation Tom had never picked up. Calloway pinned a small replica of the medal, the one he had been carrying in his wallet for years, on the chance that he ever found the man it belonged to, onto the lapel of Tom's worn field jacket. He did not give a speech. He simply said, "Welcome home, sir. Welcome home." Then he stepped back and he saluted, and he held the salute until Tom Brennan very slowly raised his own hand and returned it. In the weeks that followed, the Airshow Association passed a new policy. Any veteran who could produce documentation of having flown, crewed, or been extracted by a static display aircraft would be given private access to that aircraft, a chair to sit in, as much time as they needed, and a member of the restoration team to keep them company if they wanted one. They called it the Brennan Rule. Garcia, the crew chief, drove out to Tom's house every Sunday afternoon for the next 2 years, and helped him finish the wooden ramp he had been trying to build for his back porch, and ate dinner at his kitchen table, and listened to stories Tom had not told another living person since 1968. Mrs. Petrie wrote a letter to Tom's local paper that was reprinted in 3 states, in which she apologized to him by name, and asked her readers to please look more carefully at the old men in worn jackets, standing quietly at the edges of crowds, because you never knew which one of them had once flown into hell on your behalf. The young security guard enlisted in the army the following spring. He wrote Tom a letter from basic training that Tom kept folded in the same pocket as the flight log, and he wrote another one from his first duty station, and another from his second, and Tom answered every single one of them in his slow, careful handwriting on yellow legal pads. Major General Calloway and Tom Brennan spoke on the phone once a week, every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock for the rest of Tom's life. When Tom passed away 3 years later in his sleep with Cobra the Labrador asleep at the foot of the bed, and the flight log folded on the nightstand, Calloway flew across the country to be a pallbearer. 6 men carried that casket to the grave. 5 of them were men whose lives Tom had pulled out of the Irdrang Valley on the 9th of February 1968, or the sons of men whose lives he had pulled out that day. Calloway was the 6th. The lesson is the oldest one there is, and we keep having to learn it. The man in the worn field jacket is not the man you think he is. The old man who moves slowly may have moved through fire when you were not yet born. The quiet ones, the ones who do not march in parades and do not wear their medals on their chests and do not talk about what they did, those are very often the ones who did the most. Respect is not something you give to a uniform. It is something you give to the human being who once wore one, and who is still wearing, somewhere underneath the field jacket and the cane and the soft-spoken voice, the soul of the young warrant officer who flew into the fire 3 times in a row because his men were down there and somebody had to go get them. The next time you see an old man standing alone in front of a piece of military hardware, looking at it the way other people look at the faces of their children, do not tell him to step back behind the rope. Walk over. Ask him quietly if he ever flew in one of those or rode in one of those or was carried out on one of those, and then listen. Because the men who came home from those birds are leaving us now, one by one every single day, and there are not many Saturdays left in which any of us will get to hear them speak. If this story moved you, if you believe the men who flew these helicopters home deserve every door opened, every rope taken down, every seat offered, every salute earned, subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because the men who lived them rarely will, and because every Tom Brennan still walking among us deserves, at least once before the end, to climb back up into the aircraft that brought him home.